You think the good guys wore white hats and the bad guys wore black? That sheriffs were heroes and outlaws were villains? Pure Hollywood fantasy. The truth is way darker. In the Old West, the line between lawman and criminal was so thin you could barely see it. Some men wore a badge in the morning and robbed a bank by sunset. Others spent years enforcing the law before deciding crime paid better. Today, you're going to hear 15 true stories about lawmen who threw away their badges and became the very thing they swore to stop. Subscribe to our channel and drop some hype in the comments to help us out. Ever heard the legend of the sheriff who protected gold miners from ruthless bandits? Forget it. In Bannock, Montana, Henry Plummer wore the badge, but he also ran the most feared road agent gang in the territory. Voters thought they'd elected a savior in 1863. What they got was a man accused of masterminding robberies on the very stagecoaches he was sworn to protect. Gold vanished, witnesses disappeared, and bodies piled up along the trails from Bannock to Virginia City. The so-called Innocence Gang, with Plummer at the helm, left a trail of blood and empty strongboxes, at least according to the vigilantes who finally caught him. But here's the twist. The evidence against Plummer reads like a script penned by his enemies. The Vigilance Committee's minutes, still locked away in the Idaho State Archives, list his crimes in chilling detail, but modern historians poke holes in the story. No court ever convicted him. No neutral newspaper confirmed the scale of his supposed crimes. Even his election as sheriff is disputed in some records. Was Plummer a criminal genius or just a convenient scapegoat for a mob hungry for justice? Either way, on January 10, 1864, the mob made up its mind. They dragged Plummer, along with deputies Buck Stinson and Ned Ray, to the gallows at Hangman's Gulch. No trial, no last words that anyone bothered to write down. The sheriff died with a rope around his neck, and his legend was set in stone by the men who hanged him. Now, if Plummer was the shadowy puppet master, Bob Olinger was the brute who didn't bother to hide his violence. In Lincoln County, New Mexico, Olinger's badge was a license to terrorize. Appointed deputy under Pat Garrett, he enforced the law with a shotgun and a sneer. Witnesses swore he beat prisoners for fun and used his authority to settle scores during the Lincoln County War. Olinger's favorite trick was loading his shotgun with dimes instead of buckshot, because he claimed it made a bigger mess. No court ever charged him, but everyone in town knew who to fear. Olinger's end came not from a courtroom, but from a jailbreak. On April 28, 1881, while he stepped out for lunch, Billy the Kid seized his chance. The Kid called out, "Hello, Bob," and fired both barrels of Olinger's own shotgun straight into him. The so-called lawman died instantly, dropped by the very violence he'd spent years dishing out. His grave, like his reputation, is lost to time, buried somewhere near Fort Stanton, if the stories are true. 2 badges, 2 different kinds of predators. One ruled from the shadows, the other with open brutality. In the Wild West, the difference between lawman and outlaw was sometimes just a matter of who got to the trigger first. You think justice was served in smoky saloons and dusty courts? Think again. Sometimes the man behind the bench was the one writing the death warrant. Take John Selman, the so-called lawman who settled scores with bullets, not verdicts. In El Paso, on August 19, 1895, Selman walked into the Acme Saloon and shot John Wesley Hardin in the back of the head while Hardin was rolling dice. The El Paso Herald called it self-defense, but the coroner's inquest was more about who owed who money than who fired the shot. Selman posted bond and walked free, never facing a real trial. His badge did not stop him from running rustling rings or raiding rival ranchers with his own posse. In the end, United States Deputy Marshal George Scarborough put 4 bullets in Selman, and the city barely blinked. But the courtroom was not just a stage for gunplay. It was a license to run a criminal empire. Meet Hyman Hoodoo Brown, appointed Justice of the Peace in Las Vegas, New Mexico, in 1879. Brown turned his courtroom into headquarters for the Dodge City Gang. If you were a gang member, every killing was ruled self-defense. If you were a rival, the coroner's report might as well have been your death sentence. Brown fixed trials, married couples, and ordered executions, all from the same wooden chair. By February 1880, citizens were done. Petitions flooded the city council, and a mob stormed the courthouse. Hoodoo and his crew vanished overnight, leaving behind a stack of rigged dockets and a town that finally realized the judge was the real outlaw. If you think the law was brutal in the States, try crossing the border. Dave Rudabaugh started as a city marshal in Pueblo, Colorado, but soon traded his badge for a 6-shooter and a train schedule. After a string of robberies and a failed alliance with Billy the Kid, Rudabaugh ended up in Parral, Chihuahua. On February 18, 1886, after a drunken card game, he was shot dead in a cantina. Locals cut off his head and stuck it on a pole in the town square, a warning that even gringos with badges were not untouchable. The photograph of his severed head made the rounds, proof that the Wild West's most dangerous lawmen could meet the same fate as any outlaw. So why did these men trade justice for blood and gold? Money talked louder than any oath. A sheriff's pay in the cattle towns could be doubled by pocketing a cut from freight companies or skimming gambling profits. Judges like Hoodoo Brown made more from bribes and extortion than from their official salary. Even frontier deputies hustled for side money, guarding gold shipments for a private fee, sometimes robbing the very wagons they were paid to protect. The line between lawman and criminal was not just thin, it was erased by greed, power, and the promise of easy money. Keep watching, because the next badge might be hiding a murderer, a thief, or something even worse. You think the Wild West was all shootouts and 6 guns? Sometimes the real heist happened in broad daylight with nothing more than a pen and a ledger. Forget the saloon brawls. Let's talk about the lawmen who found crime in the fine print. Meet mysterious Dave Mather, Deputy United States Marshal for Socorro County in the early 1880s. His badge didn't just open doors, it opened vaults. Mather figured out that chasing outlaws was dangerous, but chasing bounties on paper could pay even better. He started filing bounty vouchers for arrests that never happened, pocketing reward money for criminals who either didn't exist or had already been caught by someone else. The Santa Fe Trail was safer than his books. Auditors in Leadville and Socorro started noticing a pattern. The same names, the same dates, the same miraculous captures, always signed by Mather. When the questions got too close, he vanished. No body, no grave, just a trail of rumors. Some said he skipped town after a failed robbery. Others swore he was murdered by his own partners. To this day, the story of Dave Mather ends with a question mark. The only thing certain, he made more money with a forged signature than most outlaws made with a gun. But Mather wasn't the only one cooking the books. William Brooks, known as Billy, wore the Marshal star in Leadville, Colorado during the mining boom. With gold and silver pouring through the town, Brooks had his hands on the till. He skimmed off the top, ran gambling rackets from the back room, and paid off his deputies with hush money. When a city audit in 1889 finally caught up with him, the numbers didn't add up. Thousands of dollars missing, false arrest fines, and a side business in protection fees for saloon owners. Brooks was convicted that year and sentenced to life behind bars. He died in prison in 1902, but not before teaching every hustler in the Rockies how to turn a badge into a blank check. No gunfights, no bloody standoffs, just ink, paper, and a steady hand. In the Wild West, the most dangerous weapon might have been the ledger, so next time you picture the frontier's worst criminals, look past the wanted posters and check the town's balance sheet. The real outlaws might be the ones who never fired a shot. Think gunfights were just outlaws versus lawmen? Think again. Sometimes the badge was just a ticket to the bloodiest seat in the house. Take Ben Thompson, the so-called hero who wore the Marshal's star in Austin, Texas. On March 11, 1884, Thompson walked into the Vaudeville Theater in San Antonio expecting a handshake and a drink. Instead, he found an ambush. The men who had once toasted him as a lawman now waited in the shadows, pistols drawn. The first shot hit him in the back of the head. By the time the smoke cleared, Thompson's body was riddled, some say with up to 13 bullets, though the coroner's count was lower. King Fisher, his friend and fellow gunman, died beside him. No one was ever convicted. The message was clear. Even the toughest badge could not save you when your enemies were writing the script. Now meet Dallas Stoudenmire, the marshal who turned El Paso into a shooting gallery. In his first week on the job, he killed 3 men in 5 seconds, 2 with his own guns, 1 by accident. The newspapers called it justice. The townsfolk called it terror. Stoudenmire's record only grew from there. Rival lawmen, drunks, anyone who crossed him, he met them all with a pair of Colt revolvers and a hair-trigger temper. His badge did not protect the innocent. It protected his right to settle every score with a bullet. By the time he was gunned down in a saloon brawl, his kill count had outpaced most of the outlaws he chased, but not every criminal lawman relied on gun smoke. John Kinney, the self-styled U.S. Marshal of New Mexico, had a different trick. He built a fake militia on paper at least. Kinney forged muster rolls, invented payrolls, and claimed to be organizing defenses against rustlers and Apaches. In reality, his militia was a gang of rustlers, using the cover of law to raid ranches and intimidate anyone who stood in their way. Territorial records never listed his unit, but Kinney waved his bogus commissions like a shield. When the scams caught up with him in 1874, he slipped quietly out of the marshal's office. No trial, no headlines, just a new name and a fresh racket somewhere else. So what do these stories have in common? The badge was supposed to mean order. Instead, it became a mask, sometimes for a killer, sometimes for a thief, sometimes for a whole private army. The West was not tamed by honest sheriffs and brave marshals. It was carved up by men who blurred the line between law and crime until nobody could tell the difference. When the smoke cleared, the only real law was who could buy the biggest gun or the most loyal posse. And if you think that kind of power came with accountability, look again. In the Wild West, justice was just another word for who got to pull the trigger first. Ever wonder how a wanted man could turn himself into the most feared badge in Wyoming? Meet Frank Canton, but do not bother looking for that name in the old wanted posters. Back then, he was Joe Horner, a bank robber on the run, dodging the hangman's noose. When the law closed in, he vanished. Months later, he reappeared as Frank Canton, starched collar, shiny badge, and a new set of fingerprints on the county payroll. No one in Johnson County cared to ask where he had come from, as long as the cattle barons got their way. Canton's real talent was not enforcing the law, it was erasing his past. He led posses that seized herds from small ranchers, signing livestock seizure sheets with a flourish. The official records list hundreds of cattle recovered from rustlers. The truth was, many of those so-called rustlers were rival settlers who ended up dead or run off their land. In 1892, Canton rode at the front of the invasion force during the Johnson County War, armed with a badge and a private hit list. The dossiers from that spring read like a roll call of targeted enemies, burned homesteads, missing men, and livestock funneled straight to the big ranches. But Canton was not the only lawman who turned violence into a job description. Tom Smith, known as Bear River Tom, wore his badge like a license to terrorize. In Utah, he led colonial raids against native communities, seizing horses and cattle by the dozens. The official reports called it lawful relocation. The settlers called it protection. The people on the other end called it theft and murder. Smith died in 1882 during a standoff, but not before his brand of badge-backed brutality left scars that never healed. So when you hear stories about the West being tamed by honest sheriffs, remember this. Sometimes the only thing separating the badge from the outlaw was a change of name or the color of the victim's skin. You want to believe the West cleaned itself up, that the worst lawmen paid for their crimes, but the truth is messier and darker. William Tilghman, once a celebrated deputy marshal, didn't ride off into the sunset a hero. He ended up in a San Francisco courtroom, convicted of rigging police contracts and extorting the same gambling dens he was paid to police. He served 5 years behind bars, his name wiped from the honor roll. Meanwhile, Chris Madsen, the Texas Ranger who made settlers tremble, never faced a single charge. Complaints stacked up in Ranger files, cattle seized without warrants, homesteads burned, property confiscated in the name of the law. But Madsen retired quietly in 1922, outliving almost every man he ever arrested. Then there's Jeff Milton. Long after his days as a city marshal, Milton found himself on the wrong end of a grand jury indictment for diverting city funds and cutting deals with railroad bosses. When the heat closed in, he vanished across the border, leaving Colorado Springs with a missing fortune and a trail of bribery files. No arrest, no trial, just another badge gone bad, lost to the desert. So what drove these men to trade justice for profit? It wasn't just greed. 4 forces kept repeating: money from mining and railroads, private law for hire, vigilante mobs when courts failed, and a culture that worshipped violence as manhood. In the Wild West, the badge was never a guarantee of virtue. It was just another tool, and sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the room. So, still think you can spot the hero just by the badge? Today, power still tempts the same old corruption, just with new uniforms and better public relations. The real danger isn't outlaws, it's the people we trust to keep order, rewriting the rules as they go. Like, subscribe, and tell us which story shook your trust the most. Next week, we dig up the secrets they never wanted found.